Faith and Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the second Sunday after Epiphany for the week of January 19th, 2020, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited that we have the ability to be able to be working through something like this, and with where I am at currently, I don't have to be worrying about brush fires and things like that. So I'm going to turn the early introduction here over to the people of Australia. We'll get into talking about this a little bit more this week in the podcast, but the devastation that we have seen with wildfires ravishing the whole country of Australia. And I think that's one of the things where we don't necessarily always understand how much of Australia is on fire and how many things have been lost, not just homes, but animals, getting into the millions, if not billions of animals lost. And I think it's one of these things that we just have a hard time in our brain comprehending. And it's one of, again, I would argue one of the problems within the human experience is if it's not affecting me, a lot of times we have a hard time relating or a hard time really feeling sympathy unless we have some connection to it. And so I'm just going to turn over the early part of this to be thinking about these brothers and sisters in Australia and the whole continent of Australia as they're going through these brush fires. And I think it's a really good time to be thinking about that, with this being here in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and that we're thinking about racism, we're thinking about division of people, and sometimes I would argue that Dr. King would also say that it's not just racism, it's not just the aspect of racism within people, it's the aspect of us not caring about our neighbor, the separation of people. And so I'm going to say, if you haven't spent some time thinking about looking into what's going on in Australia, I would argue take some time and look at it and spend some time in prayer this week about that. So before we get into this week's podcast, we have to dig into last week's Twitter question, which was a twofold question. I asked if you had been part of citizen science and what was your ideas and thoughts about citizen science. But the second question, the theological question, was, are you using your gifts effectively? And I think it's a really difficult question. It's something that, like I said last week, you're constantly reevaluating, constantly reflecting upon, but it's something that we also have to remember we're growing into. There's gifts that we are receiving constantly, different abilities, different things that we're learning that changes our trajectory, changes on what we can become, who we are, things that push us, challenge us, and force us to grow. And I think in the world in which we're in right now, we have to remember that the best parts of each other is what makes humanity so amazing, is that the gifts that each of us bring to the table. It's not this world of competition and opposition. It's a world of coming together, united, and realizing the different gifts that we have in people and pushing that narrative forward. And I think it's one of these points where the church really should lean into that and push that and challenge our congregations to do the same. Because I think there's so much division that we're finding within the world that there's a point of, if we lean into our gifts and recognizing each other's gifts, that then we maybe have the possibility of working together more. And I think that's where we're trying to get toward. But let's jump into this week's text. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 1, verses 29 through 42. This is a really interesting text to me. It's two parts. You get John is kind of the main character in this. Jesus has one line where he's saying, "Come and see," coming out of verse 39. But it's John proclaiming and saying, I baptized this man. I saw the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of God descending upon this man from heaven like a dove, and that this is the Son of God. And then he comes back a next day and again is saying this, and it's Jesus beginning to call some of his disciples to come and follow him in the ministry. And I think there's some interesting things that we can reference and think about with that, but I'm going to leave the summary just at that. The first reading this week is out of Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 through 7. This is a point within the narrative where you're having the tribes of Israel coming back together. And so we have this idea of we were knit together, and that it's through Christ that brings us all together as a group, as Israelites, as the people of God. It's through the following of God that we are united, instead of seeing the divisions between us, to come together as the tribes of Israel, instead of being individual sections of the family of Jacob. The psalm this week is Psalm 40, verses 1 through 11. This is a nice text to look at when we're turning things over to God, when we're giving God our life and letting Him lead our life, how much that He opens our eyes to different things and turns our heart and gets our mind, our thought, our hearts, our thoughts directed toward how He wants us to be, and that He will continue to protect and continue to be there for us, but yet that we need to be able to do that first part, do that first sacrifice on that. The second reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. This is going to be a continued text from 1 Corinthians. We're reading this for 5 weeks, and it's a very interesting introduction. You get the traditional Paul's welcome that you get in a lot of his letters, the grace and peace to you from God our Father, that we recite typically in most services almost every week. But we get the beginnings here of what Paul is referencing of God has given you the gifts and the knowledge and the things that you need to be able to do the work that He has set aside for you, and that you need to be able to trust those and lean into those. And it's not that you're lacking, that He has given you everything that you already need. You just need to trust it. But before we get into how does this tie to faith and science, we have to do our shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcast, their commentaries, their discussion, for me being a non-ordained person, I love being able to listen to not one, not two, not three, but 4 seminary professors break down these texts on a week-to-week basis, and it helps me give direction for this podcast every week. So, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Second of all, if you haven't checked out God Friended Me, I would say it's worth a listen. It's worth checking out. It's a great show on CBS that kind of shows and breaks down how God probably works in today's world through different people, and how at times we may not even recognize it. And I really enjoy seeing how God uses people for His will in God Friended Me on CBS. So I would highly recommend checking that out. When we look at this gospel text and we contemplate and consider what is all going on here, it's John being this ringer, in a way being the person who is trying to alert all these people that, look, the Messiah has come. Look, I have seen the gifts that He has. Trust in this man. And yet we still have the slow gathering of disciples coming through this. And so when I was thinking about this, it took a little bit to think of ways in science that we have somebody saying we have something that's going to change something dramatically, and it actually does. So earlier this month, we had CES in Las Vegas, the Consumer Electronics Show, and that is notoriously a show of a lot of people bringing prototypes, concepts, different ideas of what could be, and it may never actually go to mass production, or things that they're hyping up that are going to be the next big thing and really don't ever end up getting any legs to become the next big thing. So I had to really think hard on things that really are like that, and I have a positive story and a negative story, and I'll start with the positive story today. And the one that I can think of is in 2007, when Steve Jobs walked onto an Apple stage and released the iPhone. And at the point of when that was coming out, we have to remember where we were at with cellular devices. We had still flip phones were really big. If you had a more of a smarter phone, remember it was using a stylus and had probably some type of bootloaded version of Windows as the operating system, or some poor operating system that needed the stylus then if you had that to be able to interact. Otherwise, it wasn't a smartphone. It was a dumb phone. It made some calls. It texted people. Maybe you could do some very casual internet browsing, but nothing of consuming video, nothing of seeing really a full website, and how much you would crave going back to some type of desktop or laptop to actually get work done. And you had Steve Jobs enter the stage saying that the stylus was not really a valuable thing. It made the interaction with the device weird. It just wasn't the way that it should be. So if you wanted to touch something, then touch it. And I remember as a young child with Windows 98, Windows XP, and I remember when you would have where the computer was really trying to process something hard and taking a lot of time. And I remember even sitting on my parents' computer and wanting to just be able to press an icon to get it to open up. And in 2007, when Steve Jobs released the iPhone, was the beginning of modern day cellular devices and having touch capacitive screens and having that I can touch apps and having where people are using their device in everyday life. It's become a tool. There are plenty of people who do the majority of their job on their computing side on their phone. It's an amazing piece of technology. When Steve Jobs was talking about how this is a revolutionary device, we did not understand at the time how revolutionary it really was. But we can look back now and say that, yes, it was a revolutionary device. And if you remember back, Steve Jobs was criticized along with Apple for the cost of the iPhone, because the iPhone's cost was $500. It was an expensive phone for that time and that place. And is it comparable to the devices that many of us are carrying around today? No. It doesn't nearly have the processing power and the computing power that we have in devices today. But Steve Jobs did have something right when he was saying that this device was going to revolutionize the world. Just like he had predicted similarly years before with the iPod and being able to carry music in your pocket. He was right in these cases. I would say this is not that much different than John trying to get the people to understand that who they are seeing, this man, Jesus, the Messiah, the person that they have been waiting for that's going to change things, is standing in front of them. How hard it would have been to rationalize and to understand. Just like when the original iPhone came out, how people struggled with the concept of spending that much for a phone. Struggled with the idea of how is this really going to be that revolutionary of a device? And we see now that it is. I'd stated that there was two different ideas that had run through my head, and the one ties back to kind of our introduction. And I would say it's kind of more of an inactive phase right now, but we are also partially seeing some of the results. Last summer, I spent a lot of time talking about climate change and different things that we're seeing within the environment and caring about our environment. And especially when we're thinking about Australia and what's going on with Australia, it gets you to really think about quickly how multiple scientists have been predicting this type of thing going on, and that we need to change our habits. We need to change the way in which we're living to be able to maintain the lifestyle, maintain the way that we have been living, or change is going to happen. So in a way, I would argue that a lot of these climate scientists that some people have bought into and some haven't, and I'm not going to be the person right now who is going to be trying to convince you one way or the other. But I will say that there has been a lot of predictions that they have been making, that some have been correct, some have been underestimates, and some have been overestimates. But we are starting to see that there is a trend line of what they've been talking about that is starting to see and line up with predictions that they have made. Starting to say that there will be higher chances of fire and natural disasters. And if you look at, even within the United States, within the last 10 years, look at how many natural disasters we've had. How many times we're having fires out in the western part of the United States, be it California, Colorado, every summer. How we're having bigger and more effective, if you want to put it that way, devastating hurricane seasons every year, and how we've had issues like Houston, we've had issues like Puerto Rico, we've had issues like even the hurricane that hit up in New York City. That's within the last 10 years. And those are 3 major hurricane systems that went through and ripped it apart. That doesn't include even recently the devastation that we've had in Costa Rica, Jamaica, and that Australia is on fire. Multiple brush fires all over the continent. And that when you've looked at some of these models predicting what would happen, this is what was going on. They were trying to be the John and trying to say, this doesn't look good. We need to change something based off of what we can figure out. Something devastating is going to happen. Just like John is essentially trying to do a warning call to people to wake up, look at who this person is. We have a similar representation here on this side of things with climate scientists and seeing that the climate could be possibly changing, seeing the number of mass extinction rates continue to be a high point. And we've talked about that before in the podcast. So when we think about these things and think about these, in a way, messengers, the ones who are helping us see the light, the ones that God are using to be an instrument, using the gifts that they have to be able to see more of God. John is living that out perfectly. We get that in the readings where in the Psalm, if we're continuing to pour into and lean into our desire for God and giving Him control, that He will not betray us and He will show us His love and mercy, and as we continue to do His work. We get this coming from Paul as he's writing to the people of Corinth, that you have the gifts, and we'll find out later, it's just that make sure that you're using your gifts effectively, but you have the gifts that you need. God's given you that. Lean into that. When we look at why would the different tribes be coming together to become the chosen people of God? Because we're better when we're working together. When we're using the gifts, as we talked about last week, being able to utilize those gifts. God has given us gifts, then let's use them. Because my gifts are not going to be the same as your gifts. Because if everybody had the same gifts, we'd have a lot of Faith and Science podcasts and not a lot of people listening to them. We have to be able to understand the gifts in which God has given us. We have to be able to listen and see and be still critical thinkers to cut through the noise. But are there people trying to lead us and show us something that's going to get us closer to God? If you think about Steve Jobs when he was up on that stage, he was trying to show a new way of life. He was trying to, in a way, see what the future that he had in his head being presented in that device and how it was going to change things. We look at climate scientists saying we need to change our habits, otherwise we will be forced to change. John is saying we need to turn our attention and change our focus to focusing on the Messiah, who at that point was right in front of them. I've seen it. I know this is true. I'm not pulling your leg. This guy is the real deal. How often we're skeptics, how often we want to deny, how often we want to figure out excuses, how often we want the easy way out. And as we go through this faith, as we go through this life, we realize there aren't easy ways out. And that the responsibility that comes with being a Christian, yes, in ways makes life easier, but in a lot of ways also makes it more difficult. But in the difficulty, we know we have someone working with us, being with us, guiding us still, being that ever encouraging coach to push us to be the person that he made us to be. I guess one other example that you could use, and it's not as much of a faith and science perspective, but I think about when I was in athletics and I've been on different teams. You have some type of leader, a coach, who is trying to push you to become the best that you can be. And a lot of times when you are doing what you are taught to do, if you're doing it well, people will talk. People will start saying, you need to notice this guy. You need to look at this guy. This isn't that much different than John. If we look at, in putting a positive spin on these different subjects, Steve Jobs noticing that there was a different way, something that would revolutionize and help connect people, help us be able to do more than we ever have and be able to be a phone call away at all times and being able to connect with the world in a different way than we ever have before. We look at that we were noticing as climate scientists, something's changing. We can do something about this, but we need to let people know. Our world is looking for these leaders, the ones who are filled with the Spirit or filled with insight, filled with wisdom. Maybe that's our infatuation from a couple weeks ago with the Magi coming to Jesus, is that they were being able to put the pieces together when most of us weren't able to. And John is trying to put the pieces together for these people around them. And we can look back and see that there's been multiple other people who've been putting the pieces together around us. And sometimes we saw it, and sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we're being encouraged like a good coach. Sometimes then we're getting the coaches to talk to other people saying, you have to check this out. You got to look at this data. You got to look at how this device, this idea is going to change our world. You have to look at how this potentially, if we do not change what we're doing, is going to drastically change how we live. We like being noticed, and God knows that. And that's why God gave us gifts. Gifts to be able to help each other understand and notice God. And there's going to be times in everyone's life where we are called to lead and put ourselves out there. And I just pray that when that time comes, that we have the confidence to do so like John. Because it ain't easy being one of the early adopter. It's not easy putting yourself out there like that. And sometimes we forget that. We want to be critical. We want to sit there on the sidelines and just ridicule and persecute and pick apart all the problems with something. And the problem with that is then we're not using our gifts to help. Yes, there's a point to being critical, but there's also a point of realizing that, yes, you're right. Let's buy in. Or let's see what this is about. If this guy is this confident, this firm, that he has seen these things and knows that it's heaven descending and he's just not letting it go. And he's respected within the community to some extent, at least within the church at this point, John is. Maybe he really is onto something. It's just like how we can learn from each other's of different denominations, different faiths, to start coming together as the church, capital C. Instead of continuing to divide and divide and divide, when are we going to work together to see Christ walking through? So the Twitter question this week is, where in your life have you seen someone testify and later realize they were right? Where in your life have you seen someone testify and later realize they were right? And that later could be nearly immediately, and that later could be 15, 20 years ago. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know in my life there has been plenty of times where I've been wrong, plenty of times where I've missed the signs, plenty of times where I have exited on the wrong exit in life and have to get back on the freeway of life to find my right exit. It's hard putting yourself out there, and it's hard being that person to say this is where you need to exit and why, and being confident and firm in what you're believing. And that's the thing that I really look up to in this text with John. And I think it's something that we all can work on and all can consider. Scientists do it in a lot of ways on a consistent basis because that's partially what the job describes, but I don't feel like it's that unique. All of us in our jobs and professions and different phases of life have to at some point stand up and say this is what this means, and have to stand firm and wholeheartedly believe it. John shows us that in the faith we have to do the same thing. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.